Well, this is another exciting edition of our program where we're able to do a deep dive with someone who is a pioneer in the field of understanding nutrition, understanding it with fresh eyes, but looking at real data and not going into agendas or what have you, but really trying to understand the root cause of the epidemic of chronic illnesses that have plagued the Western world and other places of the world that have imitated the West. And to do that, I have a special guest. He's an ophthalmologist. He's a retired professor. He's the founder of Cure AMD Foundation. That's cureamd.org. We have with us Dr. Chris Knobbe. How you
Hey,
doing?
David. I'm great. How are you? Thanks for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be here.
And very good. And by your last name, I should say, may the force be with you, right?
Right, right. And get this, I'm not a Star Wars fan. I've
Uh-oh.
never watched one of the movies. I just can't get into it.
Are you
But
a Star
anyway,
Trek fan?
yes, I was a Star Trek fan, but see, I'm old enough. I grew up with that.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of Star Wars fans are just like, my goodness, how could someone be named after one of our heroes and be a Star Trek fan? That's just a cruel fate,
Yeah,
huh?
it was a funny thing. The other day, so my last name's Kenobi, and I had to give my address, and we live on Empire Avenue.
Uh-oh.
And a guy goes, "You're a Kenobi and you live on Empire Avenue?" And I said, I never thought about it. And I said, "Yeah, and I'm not a fan anyway." So,
And there's nothing to see here. You got to do the force magic.
right,
You
right.
will no longer eat vegetable oils, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Well, very good. So you're an ophthalmologist, and that's your training, but you've been on a journey of health. You started, I guess, in the paleo world after you probably were in the standard American diet for how long? How much of your life did you spend in the normal world where everybody else is?
Until I was 50 years old, and I'm now 59.
Okay, so you've had a 9-year journey away from the normie land of conventional, whatever you want to eat world. And what led you to start looking elsewhere outside of eat whatever you want?
Right. So, David, I'll keep this really short, but my backstory and the reason I'm here today is because of my own suffering. Like a lot of nutrition researchers, I got into this because had suffered with arthritis that really began when I was maybe 33, 34 years old, and I had seen a number of my colleagues, physicians, family doctors, internal medicine, orthopedic surgeons, and even 2 rheumatologists, and things were just getting worse and worse and worse. And by the time I was 50, I was absolutely miserable in most of my joints throughout my body, especially my knees, but even my elbows, shoulders, and my neck. And um, a rheumatologist had recommended I go on colchicine, an immunosuppressant. And the very next day, my brother mentioned to me paleo diet. And I'd never even
Huh.
heard about it. Like the typical physician, I didn't know anything about nutrition. I mean, absolutely nothing, even though I was always, I grew up an athlete and I was always, pretty fit. And that was a huge part of my life, but I didn't know what I was doing. Anyway, at that time I got grains and dairy out of my diet, and within 8 days, David, my arthritis was like 80% better, and
Wow.
it was such a dramatic change that it just spurred me to want to learn everything I could about nutrition, and so that's when I began this investigation. And um, but anyway, I can tell you more and bring you more up to date with where I am today if you want me to go on about that. But that's basically how I got started. It was my own arthritis.
I know someone, you're an ophthalmologist. I know someone who suffers from astigmatism and difficulty with eyesight, and they've noticed whenever they do a keto or carnivore-ish diet that their eyesight seems to improve. So I don't know, if you've noticed that at all with anything you've looked at, and perhaps it's the vegetable oil that's being eliminated that's making the big improvement. Is that what you would say? for eyesight.
Yeah, for a thing like that, and I mean, and that's an entirely different topic. If we start talking about refractive error, meaning myopia, astigmatism, hyperopia, or farsightedness, and I mean, and those are definitely also driven by processed foods. But in his case, the short-term changes are probably because he's consuming more fat-soluble vitamins, particularly vitamin A. So when he goes keto, he's probably getting more, animal foods and maybe organ meats that are rich in vitamin A. Maybe even more butter, eggs, things like that are giving him more vitamin A, and which reduces even dry eye syndrome. But that's a huge tangent, that I don't think we ought to go down.
Yeah. Well, generally speaking, do you see that animal foods and their vitamins are more readily available for, the whole idea that we're on a different operating system than plant matter? Or is that, are the animal vitamins more, uh, digestible for our operating system? It's like Mac versus PC, and plants are on different
Yeah,
operating systems.
like Paul Saladino's argument, right?
Right, right.
And I agree with Paul 100%. There's absolutely no question that animal foods and organ meats and, eating the whole animal nose to tail gives us all the nutrients we need. And there's never anything wrong with consuming 100% of your diet from pastured, 100% pastured grass-fed animals, for example, and pasture-raised animals, beef, pork, chicken, fowl, and then wild-caught fish. You'll never go wrong doing that. And yes, I mean, it's obvious people can can be extraordinarily healthy on 100% carnivore. And as I mentioned, before we began recording here, I'm not a low carb guy. I'm not a low fat guy. I'm not a low protein guy. Although I will support any argument and any position to go down any of those paths.
Right.
What I think, what my now nearly decade of investigation and research has led me to believe is that it is processed foods that are driving the enormous bulk of our chronic disease, heart disease, hypertension, stroke, cancers, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, autoimmune disease. The list just seems endless, but it's all reality. All of these conditions, and I can go back through this if you want me to, but these were all medical rarities for the most part in the 19th century. Even in the very early 19th century, even cancer was. And we can talk about the, what's happened with our food supply and how that's changed all that, and why now we see that all of these disorders are extraordinarily common and causing the enormous bulk of our deaths and suffering and loss of health span, not just lifespan, but health span, is because of 4 foods essentially, and it's refined and added sugars, refined cereal grains, which essentially most of that is white flour, vegetable oils, which are better termed seed oils, and trans fats. And you put those 4 things together, and those now are 63% of the American diet as of 2009. And if you look at the world's diet, 75% of the world's diet is now processed food. So it's processed foods are essentially nutrient deficient and potentially toxic foods. And when I say toxic, I mean that primarily comes from seed oils, vegetable oils, and trans fats, and very possibly the fructose component of sugar. And so ultimately, though, particularly the seed oils and trans fats, they are pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, directly toxic, and we can get into that, and nutrient deficient. They don't have any fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, and K2, and these are critically important to our health. And I can give you the backstory on all of this and talk about the history of of some of these major disease conditions like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity. We can go through that if you want. And
Sure.
I can do it quite quickly.
Yeah.
If,
Well,
if you
first of
want.
all, yeah, let's go through the history. But first of all, what does pro-oxidative mean? I hear that word a lot, but for, let's start with some of the basic issues. You said that seed oils are pro-oxidative, right?
Yeah. So, okay, this is the hardest possible thing to explain, without a lot of slides
Yeah.
and biochemistry. But when trying to give you the best possible example of this. So, for example, when you consume seed oils, they're rich in omega-6. And omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids are both polyunsaturated. And polyunsaturated fats have double bonds. And these double bonds leave a position open where they can become oxidized. In other words, they can be attacked by a free radical, like a hydroxyl radical is the primary one. And this results in and these are produced by I think it's 10 to the 21st molecules of hydroxyl radicals in our body every day. It's just an extraordinarily huge number. And so, but anyway, so these polyunsaturated fats, they then can become oxidized, and that creates a lipid hydroperoxide. And this lipid hydroperoxide then can degenerate into toxic metabolites. And these toxic metabolites are things like 4-hydroxynonenal, which is 4-H&E, malondialdehyde or MDA, oxidized linoleic acid metabolites like 9 and 13-HODE, acrolein, carboxyethylpyrrole, and guess what? That's just 5 categories, and there's literally hundreds of these that the lipid scientists have discovered that are toxic to our bodies and to our cells when they are consumed in any significant quantities. And so we're not only consuming them, but they're produced metabolically. Now, the second thing is, so this is an example of pro-oxidative. And then the second thing that happens really is that this pro-oxidative effect, it ultimately damages our mitochondria. And this is where we get into, without pictures, it's very hard to explain, but in essence, I'll just keep this extremely simple. This damages what's called the inner mitochondrial membrane and causes us to lose the hydrogen proton gradient that is produced, that drives the production of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And that's our energy currency in the mitochondria. That's where 90% of our energy comes from. And so the mitochondria are damaged by these omega-6, by excess omega-6s. And so now you're losing the function of your mitochondria. And what happens, David, is that this dysfunction of mitochondria, which is prevalent in all of our chronic diseases today, from heart disease, atherosclerosis, cancers, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, macular degeneration. Why do they all have this in common, that they have mitochondrial dysfunction? It is, from my viewpoint, and I think many, many researchers and scientists would agree with this, it is being driven by an excess of omega-6 fats that's driving this pro-oxidative effect, devastating the mitochondria. Now, and so anyway, so the mitochondria are dysfunctional, energy production goes down, and now, David, we're not able to properly burn fat for fuel. And when we can't burn fat for fuel, what happens is we get tired. We start storing that omega-6 fat and even more fats, and we become carb dependent. We're craving carbs because we can still burn carbs for fuel through glycolysis, because that's a different part of the cell. And so now we're becoming obese, we're getting tired, we're gaining weight, and all because our mitochondria have been poisoned by this omega-6 fat. And where does this omega-6 fat come from? It comes mostly from seed oils. This is where the enormous majority of our omega-6 fat is coming from in westernized diets. And when I say westernized, that is now almost the entire world, because the entire world is now consuming what we are consuming.
So
I hope that helps.
Yeah. Now, polyunsaturated fatty acids, that includes omega-6 and omega-3. Omega-3 gets all good PR, but omega-3 can be problematic too, right? If you eat too much of that too, or how does that fit into the equation?
Yes, I think it can. Sorry, my phone was buzzing. Yes, omega-3, I believe that there's all this emphasis about trying to consume more and more omega-3, but this will, I promise you, all the evidence shows, the research will back me up in this. There's plenty of papers which show that you will never help yourself by consuming more omega-3 unless you reduce your omega-6. And for 99.8 or 9% of the world, the way that they need to reduce their omega-6 is to reduce the seed oils. And maybe we should go back, David, and this might be a good place that I could mention that the whole world had never had seed oils, or at least 99.9+% of the world had never had a seed oil or vegetable oil up through 1865. And so then American manufacturers who had been making cottonseed oil for decades, maybe longer than that, and cottonseed oil had been used as a lamp oil, machine oil, eventually fertilizer, and then cattle feed. And then they decided, it didn't kill the cattle, and they'd worked on trying to, make it non-toxic. But anyway, so they introduced it into the American food supply in 1866, right? The year after the American Civil War ended. And they did this in a sneaky way. They began to adulterate lard and then butter with cottonseed oil. And the reason they adulterated it was because nobody was consuming vegetable oils. Nobody had ever heard of these. There was no such thing. And I think, and people didn't take this lightly. There was a lot of complaint when we were sending, by 1880, there was complaint that came out of Europe because we were sending hundreds of thousands of barrels of what was supposed to be olive oil to Europe, which was adulterated with cottonseed oil. Mm. Anyway, so eventually, so we continued to consume cottonseed oil mostly because of adulteration of our food supply. People didn't know they were getting it, but they were getting it in very small quantities. And then they decided to make soybean oil. And so that came out in 1909. And then we got all the others. And here's all the dangerous oils. So there's soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, and rice bran. Now, so I can get into the other oils too, but essentially all of those are very high PUFA, high polyunsaturated fatty acid oils, rich in omega-6. And these oils then, they began to supplant and replace animal fat, lard, butter, and beef tallow. So in 1900, 99% of the added fats in the American diet came from animal fat, lard, butter, and beef tallow. By 2005, 86% of our fats came from added fats came from vegetable oil. So in terms of added fats to our diet, we almost completely supplanted butter, lard, and beef tallow, the healthy fats, and supplanted and replaced them with vegetable oils.
So added fat doesn't include like eating a steak with fat on it.
No, it doesn't. Okay. But the thing is if you do the math and you start looking at our fat consumption, it is enormous. For example, okay, so let me give you some data. So in the year 1865, the whole world, including Americans, our seed oil, vegetable oil consumption, zero. Or you could say 0.00001%, because there was a couple of populations that had consumed some things like, some very small amounts of seed oils, all right? So
how did they make them if it was like so far back then?
How'd they make seed oils?
Yeah, you said those couple populations. I was just curious. Right.
Oh, well, mostly they would press them.
Okay.
They could, they could press some seeds and make some oils. And
I see.
of course there's been, and this gets more and more complicated, but there's been, coconut oil, which is a healthy oil, but some of these have been around for centuries or even millennia, but mostly consumed in small amounts. And if we get into all the oils, we get really complicated.
Yeah.
Because here, let me just put it to you this way. Yes, a coconut oil, palm kernel oil, and perfectly good, authentic olive oil, yes, these may be okay, but here's the thing. 98% of the oils consumed in the United States are none of those. They are all these other high PUFA dangerous oils. So I just always try to, let's get to the big picture before we get into all the details, because if we need to get to the low-hanging fruit, because the enormous majority of people, if they just get all of these oils out of their diet, their health is going to start changing literally that day for the better, and dramatically within months and years, just dramatically. But so we're 0 grams of vegetable oils in 1865 by, and so let me give you the omega-6. So in 1865, we got, okay, I'm sorry, let me stick with the seed oils just for example, okay, to follow up with that. Okay, so 1865, we're at 0 grams a day in the United States. 1900, we're at 2 grams a day. 1960, I think it was, no, 1950, we're at 40 grams a day. 2010, 80 grams a day of vegetable oils in the US. This is all published from our research. 80 grams, David, a gram of fat is 9 calories. 80 grams is 720 calories. So if you're on a 2,400 calorie a day diet, about a third of your calories, and this is what we calculated, 32.5% of Americans' calories are coming from vegetable oils. And then people will go, well, no, that's not me because I'm not using any vegetable oils. You don't need a single drop of vegetable oils in your cabinet or in your cooking to get 80 grams a day because it's in all the processed foods.
Like crackers and chips.
Yeah, crackers, bread, canned, products, fast foods out, out the wazoo, restaurant foods that are all cooking with vegetable oils. Why? Because they're dirt cheap and people don't know the difference. People are told they're healthy by some of our major nutrition institutions. And so so now they're consuming 80 grams a day, 720 calories a day, published. This is in our paper from Medical Hypotheses in 2017. This is, and this evidence all comes from data that came out of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Well, the FAO is, the only thing you could say about it is the numbers may be too low, but never too high, because they're getting manufacturing data about what we're consuming. So you see these massive factories that are producing vegetable oils, and why are they so massive? Because they're producing almost a third of Americans' calories. It's extraordinary. And with that, we went from all these diseases being medical rarities for the most part, including heart disease, macular degeneration, and obesity, and diabetes, and metabolic syndrome, for example. They're rarities in the 19th century, and now extraordinarily common today, and killing the majority of our people.
Do you know how much? Do you have any data that's reliable for the 19th century for folks with cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and
yeah, all of that? You want me to give you some of that?
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
yeah. So, how much time do we have?
As much time as we need. Yeah.
Really? Okay. Okay. So let's talk about heart disease. So and this is, everything I tell you is published evidence. All right. This is all in the scientific literature, and most of this is in our papers, my book, and in an upcoming paper that me and a big group were working on together. But in Boston, in 1811, in the town of Boston, there was, the population was about 30,000. There was 942 deaths. there wasn't a single death attributed to the heart, not one. There was 25 sudden deaths. So if you do the math, that's 2.6%. Now, probably all of those were cardiac valvular cases because that's what was killing some people from a cardiac standpoint in the 19th century. Why do I know this? Because in the 19th century, there was 8 published papers on heart attack in the entire century, and they knew what heart disease was, but but it was to some extent, but it was an extreme medical rarity. Like there was 2 published papers on a thrombotic myocardial infarction, meaning a clot like we have today by the millions, right? And in 1897, famed physician Sir William Osler, who was one of the founding partners of Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Baltimore, he reviewed his previous 21 years of hospital experience, and this is published. He had not seen a heart attack in 21 years of experience and major hospital experience in 1897. He had witnessed about 6 cases of angina, chest pain that might be related to heart disease, right? 13 years later, in 1910, he presented at a conference in London, England, to a conference of physicians, and he had recorded an additional 208 cases of angina, chest pain. Still had never seen a heart attack. So from 1876 to 1910, Sir William Osler, famed physician, never witnessed a heart attack. Well, neither had the rest of the world because they didn't exist, essentially. They were just so extraordinarily rare. Even physicians, even in hospitals, had never seen one. They didn't really know what it was. 1912, physician James Herrick in the United States published the first heart attack. Evidence of the first heart attack documented with autopsy evidence. Nobody even took it serious until about 1922 was the next response in the medical literature. Why? Because nobody knew what it was. Now all of a sudden, 1930s, heart disease with heart attacks become the leading cause of death in the United States. The leading cause. Nobody even knew what they were in 1910, right? Physicians didn't even really essentially know what they were. Okay, by 2010, 32.3% of deaths in the United States, heart disease and heart attacks. 32. So we went from essentially 0 in the 19th century to almost a third of people dying of heart disease. Okay? Cancer. Back to Boston, 1811. And this comes from a paper by Jones that was published in 2012. And I think it's in it was in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, or NEJM, the New England Journal of Medicine. I can't remember which one. But anyway, it's published evidence. Boston, 1811. 1 of 188 people died of cancer. All right. 1900, it was up to 5.8%. That's 1 in 17. 2010, 31.1% of people, almost 1 in 3, dying of cancer. So in a 200-year period, we went from 1 in 188 in 1811 to 1 in 17 in 1900 to almost again 1 in 3 in 2010. That's cancer, right? Okay. How about type 2 diabetes? So we know all the evidence shows diabetes of any type in the 19th century was extremely rare. I'm going to look at, I've got data here handy. So in 1935, diabetes, which would have been any type, was 0.37%. So that was a very significant increase. 1960, we're at 0.91%. That's a 2.5-fold increase. 1991, we're at 2.97%. That's an 8-fold increase. 2010, 6.95%. That's a 19-fold increase. 2015, 9.4%. That's a 25-fold increase. Now, this is just bona fide, documented type 2 diabetes, but we know from Joseph Kraft's work in 1970 to 1990 that 80% of Americans are insulin resistant by 1990. 80%. And today, as of just a few years ago, a couple of years ago, 88% of Americans can't meet 5 criteria of metabolic health. Only 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy.
Now, what would there be a counter argument of perhaps they weren't as good at identifying the symptoms of diabetes in the first half of the 20th century, or would that not?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, because they could measure glucose in the urine and glucose in the blood way back then. And of course, it all goes hand in hand with visceral obesity and obesity and metabolic syndrome, all of which were unknown 100 plus years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give you an example. Okay, so let's talk about obesity since we're on that path. So Scott Allen Carson is a researcher that did some incredible research. I can't tell you how hard it is to get this evidence from the 19th century. You have to be a nerd like me and dig into this for months and years to figure out all this stuff. But anyway, Scott Allen Carson gets all this data from prisoners in Texas and Nebraska. So these are men age 18 to 80. They take their height and weight when they are brought into the prisons. So men in the 19th century, age 18 to 80, obesity 1.2%. Now, the next time we have any data is in the United States is 1960, and obesity was 13%. Now, we all look back, and David, you'll do this. You look back and you go, we were lean as could be in 1960, right? You look at all the videos and pictures. But guess what? Obesity had already risen 11-fold between 1900 and 1960. 1980, obesity is still about 13 or 14%. 1988, obesity was 23%. 1999, 30.5%. 2011, 35.7%. 2015, 39.8%. And a recent paper published shows we are on target 50% of Americans, adult Americans, to be obese by 2030. 1 in 2. So now, just from 1900 to 2015, obesity elevated 33-fold. How do you account for that?
Yeah.
All right. We do the same thing for age-related macular degeneration, which is my area of expertise, from ophthalmology. So just very briefly, and I won't go through the history here, but between 1850 and 1930, there was no more than 50 cases of age-related macular degeneration in all the world's literature, and it was discoverable in 1851. And there's massive evidence and just a slew of publications and atlases and research in this area. Macular degeneration just almost did not exist between 1850 and 1930. 50 cases in the world's literature. Guess how many there are today in 2020? 196 million people, and are on target to be 288 million people with macular degeneration by 2040. 540 people approximately go blind in this world every day, completely centrally blind, both eyes, in the world. 540 a day. And yet in an 80-year period between 1850 and 1930, there was no more than 50 cases of macular degeneration in the world's literature, and it was probably half that much. So all these things track together. You just keep looking and looking, and it's the same with metabolic syndrome and with myopia, for example. All these things track together. Why is this? Well, this was all shown by this began with researchers like E.V. McCollum in the 19-teens and 1920s, and then Weston Price in the 1930s, who showed, he evaluated people all over the world on 5 continents, 14 nations, hundreds of tribes and villages, as these people transitioned from their native traditional diets to westernized diets. And those westernized diets were these foods we're talking about. They were refined flours, added sugars, vegetable oils, and trans fats, essentially, although Price didn't talk about trans fats. But as people consumed these foods, what happened was they first developed dental decay, and then arthritis, and then cancers, and just a slew of degenerative disorders, right?
Yes.
And today we've just got thousands and thousands of studies that have, accumulated that support the same thinking and the same evidence.
And to me, it's like a big macro, detective story, a whodunit, trying to trace where all this stuff is coming from. And
Yes.
I've been fascinated with understanding the outsized role that vegetable oil may be playing behind this. At the same time, I've listened to a lot of ketogenic researchers. We've had Dr. Chris Palmer on the program from Harvard, who has been getting his patients with depression and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, getting them onto ketosis and finding significant improvement to the point where people's are not hearing voices like they've heard their whole life. And that's that's pretty amazing. And then we have stories like, Dr. Thomas Seyfried, what he's doing in Boston College, with really late term cancers that are having really difficult times being treated with standard of care. And they get on ketosis, therapeutic ketosis, and glutamine inhibitor drugs, and they're having some pretty huge breakthroughs there. So how do you put the pieces together? I think vegetable oils are a huge factor, and I want to know how mechanistically they are. For example, let's take the obesity issue for a moment. How is it that so many people have eaten lots of vegetable oils? They've cooked their foods in vegetable oils. They've eaten peanut butter, whatever, their whole life, and yet they're pretty thin even decades after eating it. Why is it that some people are expressing obesity with these seed oils, but others are thin as can be and just doing fine? Is that just a genetic thing? Some people respond to it, other people don't?
Yeah, well, first of all, more than likely, and I can't prove this, but more than likely, the people that are thin, two things. Number one is you don't have any evidence to show that that they are indeed consuming as much seed oils as the people are who are obese, right?
Okay.
Nobody has that evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Number two is that just because they're thin, well, the enormous majority of those people, roughly probably, in the range of 75%, are not metabolically healthy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Thin people are also, in our world, the majority of them are TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, right? They have visceral obesity. And visceral obesity and nutrient deficiency combines to produce the toxic milieu and the metabolic state that's driving all this disease. So thin people account for more of our disease than the obese people, right? They do, because as Robert Lustig has shown, and others, so it's like 80% of the obese are metabolically unhealthy, but 40% of the thin people, so-called thin, all right, are also metabolically dysfunctional, right? So when you look at the numbers, the so-called lean people, the people that are, that are not necessarily obese, these people account for more people that are metabolically unhealthy and sick than the people that are obese, right? So just as he says, you can't blame it on obesity. Obesity is not the problem. Obesity is a symptom of the problem. It's just a symptom like heart disease and cancer and strokes and macular degeneration, right?
Is there a genetic variation to that? Like,
absolutely.
Islanders that eat vegetable oils and Northern Europeans that eat vegetable oils may express obesity faster than East Asians that eat the same amount of vegetable oil? Is it because
100%?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Like the Asians, so they are, so the Japanese, perfect example. They're extremely resistant to extreme obesity. Now you can look back and see that their obesity was extremely small in 1950 and 1960, for example, and relatively it's increased dramatically. But the Japanese, for example, are still the leanest nation of all the developed nations on the planet, right? They are, okay? But are they metabolically sick? You bet they are, because they're consuming 39 grams of seed oils a day. So like I was telling you before we went on the air, is the Japanese were in mainland Japan and the Okinawans were consuming 3 grams of seed oils a day in 1949 and 1950, 9 grams a day by 1961, 39 grams a day by 2004. And what's happened with the Japanese? They've developed obesity. Metabolic dysfunction is huge. Like in Okinawa, it's 30% of the men, the adult men over age 40 have metabolic syndrome, and 10% of the women, a third of them. So the thing is no, they don't become obese like we do. And so Americans, you know, I think we actually tolerate the seed oils better than, you know, so in other words, people of European extraction tolerate the seed oils better than anybody else on the planet, right? Because we're consuming the most in the world. Nobody can beat us, but we're the most obese nation in the world. But for the level of consumption, we tolerate this the best, is what I believe. Now, in terms of just obesity, exactly like you said, David. So you take populations like the Hispanics and certain American Indian tribes, for example, they're extremely likely to become obese. The Samoans, you know, with seed oils, right? So they have an extraordinary likelihood for these to cause obesity, just the opposite end of like the Japanese. But in terms of getting sick, we all get sick with these. Nobody is immune to that.
So my question is, does the population's propensity to respond to seed oil consumption with higher rates of obesity correlate at all with sensitivity to the deleterious effects of the seed oils? Does that make sense? Does it correlate at all to, if you different populations, as you just explained, seem to experience obesity higher with the consumption of vegetable oils than others, right? Does that high rate of obesity to seed oil correlation correlate to the deleterious effects? You see what I mean? So if you're in the population where you're not expressing obesity from consumption of seed oils, does that correspond to less negative side effects otherwise? You know, you still get some negative effects, or you get what I mean? Is the obesity, is that a red flag that other diseases are more prone from the seed oil in your genetic group, or no? No connection?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's a question I've never been asked and nobody has ever asked. And I think it's almost impossible to answer that more than what I already did, because there's, you know, it's become so complicated. So how are you going to, you know, just for example, like I said, in Okinawa, 30% of the men over age 40 are now obese. I mean, I'm sorry, not obese, because they have metabolic syndrome, right? 30%.
Does that mean just slightly overweight? Is that what that means, or no?
No, I mean, they could be normal weight,
okay,
but they're metabolically sick.
Okay.
So that's the point is that, you know, I don't think there's any way to get, you know, that is such a fantastically complex question to answer, or the, you know, the answer would be so exceedingly complex to try to look at all that all together. I don't know how you could possibly even do it, but it's a great question.
It'd be interesting to see if sumo wrestlers are guzzling canola oil or something, you know?
Yeah, you know, I've heard people talk about that, and I don't really know the answer. I mean, now here's the thing is, you could become obese even on an ancestral diet. An ancestral diet is a native traditional diet without any of these processed food components. You just have to overeat consistently. But the likelihood that people can do that is exceedingly small, as you witnessed from the 19th century Americans, and what you witness all over the world. You know, you look at the Maasai warriors, you know, the Tokelauans, the Catawbans, the Papua New Guineans, the Chimane of Bolivia, the Ashe of Paraguay, you know, the 1950, 1960 Japanese. I could go on and on and on, right? What do all these populations have in common? None of them had any significant level of obesity, right? What do they all have in common? They all have the exact same thing in common. They didn't have processed foods. They didn't have added sugars, refined wheat flour, vegetable oils, and trans fats. It always comes back to that. You can look at heart disease, you can look at, cancers, obesity, macular degeneration. It always comes back to this. All these populations that are fantastically healthy, that's the one thing they always have in common. So could you just, have a native traditional diet, a perfectly healthy diet, and become obese? It's possible, but it's extraordinarily rare.
Which is why probably there's that traditional stigma for people who are obese, that you're slothful, like a sin, you know what I mean? Because it's like
Right.
the ancestral tradition of whoever the guy is that's got a big old belly when you're eating what we're eating has got to be sitting around a hell of a lot of time and a
Right.
lot of extra coconuts, you know what I mean? So
Right.
it's,
Yeah. So I mean,
it's kind of a
you know,
huge feat. It's kind of hard to be overweight in ancestral eating, right? It's difficult.
oh,
Yeah.
extraordinarily difficult.
Even
It's
with
just,
high sugar, right? High natural sugar. Was that
oh yeah, absolutely. I
really?
think you could eat almost all the natural sugar you want if it's in, if it's in fruits and honey. You can eat a ton of that and
Not good.
remain healthy and lean.
What about just to kind of deal with these things, because I know a lot of low carb people listen to this, but what about the argument that, well, if you eat more carbs than you need, then your body will convert it to fat, that whole idea. So if you're eating lots of fruits and you're not eating a single processed flour, no vegetable oils, none of that garbage, trans fat, but you're just gobbling up honey all day like Winnie the Pooh, and moderate walking around doing like normal people, not sitting on bed all day. What about the idea that that extra carb will be converted to or stored as fat? Does that not happen without the presence of lots of seed oils? Is that what you know what I'm saying?
Okay, yeah. So let me give you just two population examples, because I think that there are not any good randomized controlled clinical trials that can answer this question. And the reason why is because, let's just say you take a population from the United States, from Cincinnati, Ohio, and you take 200 people, and now you put them on a diet, right? And you try to put them on a high carb, low fat, whatever diet you want, right? What here's the thing. Let's say they're all 40 years old. What have they been consuming for 40 years?
Mm-hmm.
That is the most incredibly important piece of data that you could possibly know, because it affects the fatty acid profile in their fat, and that's going to not change for years. The omega-6 in your fat is the half-life is 600 to 680 days. So unless you're going to take those people and put them on an ancestral diet and control that, and you can't do it, but if you did, you probably need to control them for 8 or 10 years to get them back to ancestral levels. That's how long it's going to take, in my opinion. Now, let me give you these population examples, and you probably saw this. I presented this at Low Carb Denver back in March this year, and people can watch that on YouTube. But the population of the Papua New Guineans of Tukasinta in 1972, they were studied by researchers Sinnott and White. This is an extensive study. In fact, they were studied for years. And their diet was very interesting, because it was more than 90% of their calories came from sweet potatoes. They live at a very high altitude on a small island, but they can't get down to the sea. They can't grow hardly anything except sweet potatoes. They raised pork and chicken, but they wouldn't eat. They're kind of like the Maasai. They wouldn't eat their animals very often. They would eat them, so they're not vegans, but they would eat them on occasion, and they would feast on animal foods. But most of the time, like I said, more than 90% of their calories coming from sweet potatoes. In fact, their diet, according to Sinnott and White, published evidence, reviewed extensively, 94.6% carbs, 3% protein, and 2.4% fat. Now, this is one of the most extraordinary diets I've ever heard of. And yet they had no obesity, none, no diabetes, no heart disease, no cancers, no macular degeneration. I mean, everything about them, they were healthy. Okay, let's talk about the Japanese, and people like to talk about the Okinawans because they're the longest lived people on the planet, or they're awfully close if they're not still. Now they're losing that position, and because they are westernizing. But if you go back, and this is all published as well, I'm not going to tell you anything that's not published evidence in the scientific literature. Okay, 1949 and 1950, the Japanese and the Okinawans consumed, as I said, 3 grams of oils per day. Now those are probably sesame or peanut. Those are a lot healthier oils than are all those others I named before, right? Okay. All right. 1949 and 1950, their diets were, and I can't remember which was which right offhand, I don't have that handy, was 85% and 80% carb. The Okinawans were getting almost all their carbs from sweet potatoes. I think it was 85%. The mainland Japanese were getting almost all their carbs from refined white rice. So that's a refined grain, right? It's nutrient deficient. Nevertheless, they're fantastically healthy. All right. So now by 1958-60, in mainland Japan, the calories had gone up to 2,850 calories per person. All right, so they had all the food they could want. So you can't argue they didn't have plenty of food, right? And they're little, tiny, extremely lean people. All right. Now, what happened over the succeeding 4 decades was their carbs went from 85% down to, I think, around 50 or 55%, if I remember right. Their carbs went progressively down each decade. You can just follow it. All right. The carbs went down, the seed oils went up, right? And by 2000, they're metabolically unhealthy and they're relatively obese. 25% of the men and women roughly are over BMI of 25. So for them, they changed their categorization because Asians are normally very, very lean. So they call now, you can call it pre-obese, but their obese or overweight is now 25% by around 2000. Okay, so their carbs went way, way down and their seed oils went way up, right? They went from 3 grams a day in 1949 and 1950 to 39 grams a day by 2004. I know I'm repeating that, but it's incredibly important.
Are those seed oils that they've increased in consumption, the sesame oil that you said is not as bad as the other vegetable oils?
No, they are mostly soybean and canola and soybean and rapeseed. They're almost all soybean and rapeseed.
What about sunflower oil? That's what the Russian population eats.
Well, I mean, they don't get any almost the enormous majority of their oils now. They traditionally did use some sesame and peanut oil, but it was incredibly small amounts, right? Obviously, 3 grams a day in 1949 and 1950, right? That's what they were traditionally using, though. And so, but what did they supplant that with? Soybean and rapeseed. So almost around 98-99% of their oils now that they're consuming are soybean and rapeseed. Well, okay, so for people that don't know, if you look at the omega-6 in a grass-fed animal, like a grass-fed cow, all right, 100% grass-fed her whole life, her omega-6 is around 2%. Okay, seed oils, they run from about 20 to 70 some percent. So you're averaging around 35, 45, 40% of those oils is omega-6, right? You can't, there's nothing on the planet that comes even close to that except nuts and seeds. But the thing is nobody traditionally has ever consumed huge amounts of nuts and seeds. Almost nobody. We could go into that, but anyway. So if you look at, soybean oil is around 55% omega-6. That is incredible when you compare that to a grass-fed cow fat at 2%.
What's grain-fed cow fat? Do you know what that number is?
Yeah, it's a little bit higher, but it's not that much higher. There's a lot of other issues with grain-fed, not the least of which is that they're grain-fed with GMO, and then you're getting glyphosate, the poison of Roundup. That's accumulating in their fat and causing other problems. but their ratios go way up. So even though their fat is relatively low on a grain-fed cow, the omega-6 does go up considerably, and so I see that as a problem. But in comparison, if you just, again, we're looking at, the Pareto principle, low-hanging fruit. The thing is you could consume grain-fed cows and pork and chicken. That would be fantastically more healthy than any vegetable oil, right? Because
when you say any vegetable oil, you're putting a big red flag on eating like nuts and whole nuts too, right? Stuff like that.
Those are not vegetable oils, right? Those
right,
are,
but they have.
So the thing is could you make yourself very unhealthy by not consuming any vegetable oils and consuming huge amounts of nuts and seeds? That's a question that I wondered for 5 years until this year. And I had a lady, because I have hundreds or thousands of people reach out to me. And I had a lady that presented with a really interesting history over the last 3 or 5 years. And what she did was, she's the only person I've ever known that did this. She was convinced by a nutrition guru that she should get all of her fats from nuts and seeds. So that's what she did. She tried to get all of her fats. She just didn't eat any animal fat, right? No butter, no eggs, no meats, right? Because saturated fat is unhealthy, right? The most absurd thing you'd ever hear on the planet. It's been debunked a million times. But anyway, so she goes down this path. Well, in the next year, she developed carotid artery atherosclerosis, which is severe. This is all documented, right? She didn't have it before. She developed pancreatic problems. She became, she started heading down a path of metabolic syndrome. She started developing hypoglycemia after every meal. She was getting severely sick. She just became a very, very sick person. And, and the record all shows where she was in terms of, where she was 4 or 5 years before that, and then went on this high nuts and seeds diet, and she gets sick. Well, so this is the only example that I know of that I have data on and evidence for where a person wasn't consuming vegetable oils, but consumed the huge omega-6 from nuts and seeds, and she got very, very sick. And we'll present this in our next book, probably, as an example.
Is it sickly to eat conventional raised chicken and pork when they eat a lot of corn and soy, and then that goes into the fat? Is that going to get them a lot of omega-6 toxicity too, if you're eating chicken?
Absolutely.
Conventionally grain.
Yeah. So the animal consuming lots of grains in the form of corn and soy, they do get much higher omega-6 in their fat. And then we consume that. And like I said, it's not nearly as healthy as a pasture-raised animal, which is going to be very low in omega-6. But as I said, David, it doesn't, even the conventionally raised, pork and chicken and cattle would be, that alone would be dramatically more healthy to get your fats from those rather than vegetable oils.
So the real big take-home lesson for folks who are saying, wow, this is a lot of data, but the real take-home is, if the lowest hanging fruit that'll make the biggest dramatic improvement in your life is to eliminate the vegetable oils, which means you're basically eliminating most options to eat out at a restaurant. Or that's the biggest change I think a lot of Americans would have to make to really follow your advice here. Get rid of the processed foods. Even people eat keto ice cream and it's got sunflower oil all in it or something like that.
Yeah.
So you want to remove processed foods, processed sugar, processed flour, trans fats, and vegetable oils, and that's the big elephant in the room for you, right?
Yes. Yes.
And how long does it? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so I would say number one is I just would almost never eat at any fast food place. Just almost never.
And even diners, they cook eggs and whatever oil,
They might, yes. And you don't, you can't be sure. One thing you can do is there are two things. So when we eat out, we mostly eat either steak or sushi, because they're not going to cook either one of those in it. There's no oils in those, right? So those are pretty safe. Again, even steak, even from your best restaurants, are not 100% grass fed. They're going to be grain finished almost always. So they're not going to be quite as healthy as what you could get at home by getting, your beef from a local rancher who raises animals using ancestral traditions, right? But back to the foods. And then the other thing, so then at home, you have to just prepare all your own food and prepare it using these ancestral principles. So you can make almost any food you want to in the world and make it healthy using ancestral principles. If you want to make donuts, you use a good quality organic, maybe whole grain flour. Okay, I wouldn't say you should do this regularly, but anyway, and then cook it in what? In tallow, or in lard from a pastured animal. Now, those are going to be harder to come by, but the fact is now all of a sudden, now you've got a good grain, cooked in a good healthy fat, right? And now you could make that donut healthy. Now, I'm not sick. I don't eat donuts, okay? And I don't make donuts. And I'm just trying to give people an example, because people come to me and say, well, can I eat Mexican food? Or can I eat, Chinese food? Yes, but not from at any restaurant. Those are going to be, you're risking those having seed oils. Like all the Chinese food in westernized countries is all going to be cooked in vegetable oil, all of it.
What about people who say, okay, well, what if I get rid of these vegetable oil cooked foods and stuff, but I have them once or twice a month or once a week or something like that? Is that still bad to have them even that limited? Is it one of those things that you need to quit cold turkey for good? Or is it something that you can have vegetable oil cooked food and stuff on a weekly, but once a week or once a month or a couple times a month? Have you looked at
Well, so this comes back to the question of optimal health.
Mm-hmm.
I want optimal health, right? So I try to never consume a seed oil under any circumstances. Like I would just go hungry before I'm going to eat anything with seed oils in it. I'm not going to eat potato chips, right? Or, or I would never eat a French fry, never, right? Because it's just because you're getting vegetable oils in those. But I personally want, my body is a temple to me, and I want to take the best possible care of it that I can. So I'm never going to consume those. But if, let's say you consume those, once in a while, well, sure. I mean, it's just all a matter of, again, your overall goals and risk. So if you had potato chips in vegetable oil once a month, obviously that's not nearly as big a deal as eating them daily, right? So
for people who want to get off of them completely, how long does it take to get, because you said you store them in your fat. So if people are 20s, 30s, 40s, 50-year-old, and they're listening to the show, whatever, they've been doing this for decades, and they would say, okay, I'm done with this vegetable oil stuff. I want them out of my body. How long is that going to take? You just do cold turkey, takes years and years and years to get them out of your cells?
It takes years, but here's the thing is, a lot of these parameters in terms of, okay, let me give you the bad news first. 600 to 680 days is the half-life. In pharmacology, we know that it takes 5 half-lives to get rid of a drug, for example. So if it's 600, you can just round that off to 2 years is the half-life for these seed oils in your fat. This is all published. Again, I won't tell you anything that's not published evidence. So if you look at it, it could possibly be 8 or 10 years before you're down to the lowest levels. However, now here's the really good news. If you quit seed oils today, you will drop your pro-oxidative effect. You will drop your pro-inflammatory effect. You will start minimizing those toxins that are in the oils, right? And if you are now eating healthy animal fats in place of that, now you're getting fat soluble vitamins A, D, and K2, which you weren't getting from the seed oils, right? You've done 4 huge things to benefit your health, and that will happen that day. Your risk of a stroke or a heart attack will go down that day. In 24 to 72 hours, your risk is down, guaranteed. Because
so when are you out of the woods when you've eliminated them? Because people think 6 to 10 years. My goodness, that's
when are you out of the woods?
Out of the woods once you, in terms of the deleterious effects of vegetable oils on your body. The moment you quit, is that about a month in, 2 months in, where
I think that, you know, it's kind of like smoking, and you have to pay for your nutritional sins, as Kate Shanahan would say it. And she's a physician like me and a researcher, and she's a biochemist, and she knows this really well. She's been studying this since the late 90s or early 2000s. And, you know, that's what you have to pay for your nutritional sins. So the thing is you're going to be healthier in a matter of hours and days. But if you continue that path and you stay on an ancestral diet, and you keep these foods out of your gullet, then you're going to keep getting healthier and healthier. And eventually, you know, for me personally, I do think it was 6 or 8 years before I was starting to achieve my best possible health. But now here's some things: is there are ways to get there faster. Exercise, maybe fasting, you know, things are going to drop your weight because you will burn those omega-6s, right? Let me give this.
Yeah, how do you drain the PUFAs faster? I think that's
yeah. So I get that question sometimes. Now here's the thing: is Stephan Guyenet published this brilliant paper, and I've covered it in my Low Carb Denver and in my Ancestral Health Symposium 2019 presentation, because this study is brilliant, and it looks at the omega-6 fat in our adipose. In Americans, there was 37 studies that he collated between 1959 and 2008. Remember, I'm saying we accumulate these omega-6s in our fat, right? So in 1959, our omega-6 in our adipose, our fat, was 9.1%, I believe it was. 9.1%. All right. Guess where it was in 2008? 21.5%. Okay, now let me give you, there's only one paper, one study on any population that I'm aware of in all the world's literature where they actually did the same thing. They biopsied the adipose, the buttock fat of men in Tokelau, the Tokelauans, in 1972, and it was 3.8%. Linoleic acid, omega-6 linoleic acid. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. 3.8%. We were at 9.1% in 1959. We're at 21.5% by 2008, and it's still going up. I promise you, because our vegetable oils are still going up.
So over 20% of our fat is made up of vegetable oils in America. Is that what that number says? You're saying?
It's made up of omega-6 linoleic acid alone, and that accounts for about 90% of our omega-6. Okay, in our fat.
Okay.
So yes, 21.5% of it, and it should be 3.8%, where the Tokelauans were. Why do I know that? Because that's the only population who was not consuming seed oils, consumed a native traditional diet, and almost all their fat was coming from coconut oil.
What would you say to parents who say, "Oh, but you know, for kids, they're fine. They can eat Happy Meals, you know, French fries every now and then, keeps them happy, peanut butter sandwich, that kind of stuff." Do you think that that's let kids just do whatever they want, or should you start them at a young age, keeping these kind of vegetable oils out of their life and this kind of stuff?
Yeah. So the thing is that this is the worst possible thing for kids, and this is we're doing everything. We're killing them, and I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean that in an actual way, because when a baby is born today, and within days, weeks, or months, they're consuming our infant formula. Infant formulas, David, are made of seed oils and sugars, and primarily, and some refined carbs, and then like maybe possibly, well, I don't know what those are exactly, but anyway, but then they put in some synthetic vitamins, right? this is, as Sally Fallon Morell from the Weston A. Price Foundation says, this is the single most processed food on the planet. And why do we think our childhood cancers and leukemia and all that is through the roof, and we're killing our children with this? And then they develop dental decay, cavities through the roof, like more than 30%, right? And crooked, malformed teeth, malocclusion. All of this does not occur in populations consuming native traditional diets who don't have these foods. They develop perfectly straight, healthy, natural, beautiful teeth. And you can look at all these, you know, I present them in my presentations. You'll see in some of them, some of these pictures from Weston A. Price's research in the 1930s. And the thing is, so, and then our children get, you know, they start getting sick. They're getting obese. They're getting diabetes. And when they're even, there's a 3-year-old in Canada in the published scientific literature with type 2 diabetes. When I was in medical school in the 80s, type 2 diabetes didn't exist in people younger than about 40, right? It just didn't happen. You never saw it. Now it's in teenagers and children. Metabolic syndrome in children. Why are around 20% of our teenagers now obese? Why? Because of this, right? You know, acne. Just nothing else than that. You don't see acne in people and children on native traditional diets. It doesn't exist. Lauren Cordain published this a long time ago. Myopia, nearsightedness, it just hardly exists in populations consuming native traditional foods. So do you want good, healthy, you know, the best thing you can do for your child, and we didn't do this because I was dumb as a stick about it with our daughter, Kyla, who's now 22, and thank God she's okay and she's healthy and getting healthier because, you know, we started changing all this nearly 10 years ago. But, you know, we nearly killed her when she was a little toddler because of this, because we were feeding her the same thing that, you know, your physicians and pediatricians, you know, put them on formula. And
I think we need to,
junk.
And I think people have to be careful not to, you know, this is just my opinion, but, you know, not to overfeed even these hyper palatable fruits because they're so, you know, hybridized to be so sugary without all the nutrition. I was looking at a video that showed the difference between an apple in 1900 early versus today's apple, and it's like so much smaller, not nearly as much sugar back then, and way more nutrition, you know, more nutrients. And it's like, you know, feeding that candy fruit all the time, I think, is also probably a taxing thing, not just the processed flour and the fries and the soy, you know, formula, right? Would you say too?
Well, I'm gonna slightly disagree with you, but just like I said,
Sure.
Slightly, because I think that, you know, I would in general say that for most people, fruits and vegetables that are non-GMO, that are organic, are going to be safe. Now, there's going to be this is going to get very controversial very fast, because you can definitely tie, you know, fruits and vegetable plant foods to autoimmunity, but I think that that generally, I believe, follows a processed food laden diet that changes your gut microbiome. It just gets exceedingly complex. And so then, yes, I think, you know, eliminating plant foods for people that have autoimmune disorders can be extremely beneficial, right, but only in the face of an ancestral diet. So, but in general, if you have a child today and you want to make that child healthy, I think you can include almost all the fruits and vegetables you want to. I would keep them all organic, because you don't want your child consuming, or any of us consuming, glyphosate poison coming from Roundup sprayed on GMO crops, right? So you need, that's where I think organic is beneficial. If you can afford the little bit of extra, you know, maybe it's significant, but I think it's worth it in terms of our health. So, but I think so-called high sugar fruits, I think those can be part of a perfectly healthy diet. You know, the way I think of it is, it just, again, we're just still, this whole conversation, just big picture, 30,000, we're still at 20 or 30,000 feet. And so big picture though is, you know, you need the animal fats in general, for the most people. You need animal fats. And all traditional societies that were healthy were consuming animal foods to get what? Fat soluble vitamins, A, D, and K2. Those aren't in any plants, right? They're not in any plants, essentially. And so then the fruits and vegetables will give you B vitamins and C. Now, here's the thing. You'll get B vitamins and C out of animal meats too, particularly if you consume organ meats. And this is why, you know, now you can go back to that argument. We can start with a carnivore diet, 100% coming from, you could just make it all beef. You could just live on beef, eat the animal nose to tail. If it's 100% grass-fed, pasture-raised, can you be extremely healthy on that? Absolutely. No question in the world. That could work for anybody in any circumstance, I think. I mean, it's hard to make an argument that it's going to go wrong, because you get everything, you can get everything you need, all the vitamins, all the minerals, you know, could potentially come from that. Now, are there exceptions? Sure, there's exceptions to every rule. Yeah. But in general, this is the thing is, so people, they have to respect the fact that we are individuals and there's bio-individuality. Sure. And yes, so maybe spinach doesn't work for me and sweet potatoes don't work for me and for, you know, a million other people. But can millions of people consume those and consume those in significant amounts and be fine? Absolutely, they can. Right. Yeah. So not everything I've said is, again, I'm just big picture here, just trying to get to what's going to work. And here's the one thing, if I just make one last statement on this, and I'll shut up, is that there's one diet that doesn't work for anyone and is always going to end in disaster. And that's a sad diet, a standard American diet, a westernized diet with all these processed foods. It won't work for anyone, and it's going to end, sadly, in one of these conditions if the consumption is enough, right? It's going to end badly. There are, on the other hand, there's a diet that works for everyone virtually, and that's an ancestral diet. That is getting back to our ancestors' foods without these man-made processed foods of those 4 components, which we've talked about repeatedly. That's big picture. And if you think of it that way, use that as your guiding light and your foundation. Now you're headed down a much more healthful path. Then you can, if you've got issues with some of this, maybe you're not getting enough D, or maybe not enough iron or magnesium or zinc or whatever it is. Now you can target some of those things and start getting at details that help fix other issues.
This has been very helpful, very fascinating. Just 2 little random quick questions and we'll wrap it up. The one, okay. One is salt gets demonized a lot in the media. Have you looked at salt consumption in the West or anything to see any problems with salt consumption where we're doing it? A lot of people I've heard say, no, we need more salt, not less. And the second one is, do some of those animal fats that you mentioned, you said weight loss, exercise and weight loss can help get rid of the PUFAs that your body has stored up for years of bad eating, the omega-6s that you've stored. Can other animal fats, compete and take out those omega-6s like stearic acid? Does that come in there and battle and displace the omega-6s in your cells faster, or does that not have a relationship with getting rid of those PUFAs faster for those who want to be very proactive?
Okay, so the first question about salt is I think salt has been unfairly demonized. If you are already metabolically unhealthy and you're insulin resistant and your insulin is high and you've got a lot of metabolic issues, then there is something like, I believe, a 20% chance that salt is going to be an issue for you. And then when you start getting metabolically healthy, the huge majority of people need more salt, not less, right? And a good quality Himalayan salt gives you like 84 minerals, trace minerals, and electrolytes. So very, very healthy, right? That's the big picture there. So you might have to respect that salt could be an issue if you are metabolically unhealthy, like the huge majority of people on a westernized diet. As far as displacing omega-6s, no, you can't do it. It won't displace them if you are consuming high amounts of good, healthy fats. They're simply both going to be there, and the omega-6s, again, you're only going to get those down by eventually burning them for fuel, and the body doesn't like to burn them for fuel, but it eventually will when you get your omega-6 consumption down and keep it down. That's the only way to get there.
Why does the body not want to get rid of them if they're bad?
Oh, because because they're not bad, David.
Okay.
They're not bad. We need omega-6. So omega-6 linoleic acid, LA, and omega-3 alpha linolenic acid, ALA, are both essential fats. And we have to have these because we can't make those. These are two fats that we have to have in our diet in order to be healthy at all. Not consuming those will end in devastation, all right? But how much do we need? So we need probably around less than 2 grams of linoleic acid a day, and probably one gram or so of omega-3. Okay, so 2 grams of omega-6, if even that much. It's probably lower than that, but ballpark for people to think of. Okay, so how much are those together? A half of a teaspoon of oil, right? Of those two, omega-6 and omega-3. More than that doesn't benefit you. But why do we need them? Because those omega-6s, that linoleic acid, for example, that is an incredibly important part of mitochondrial function. And that linoleic acid, it becomes a critical component of a phospholipid called cardiolipin, which plays an incredibly important role in the inner mitochondrial membrane, and is what makes that membrane tight and holds this proton gradient that allows us to produce energy. But so that linoleic acid this is the main function of it. When you consume that half a gram or gram a day or 2 grams a day in a perfect diet, it's going to go directly into those mitochondrial membranes, and it's going to be maintained, and it's going to be in good shape. But if you now consume, like Americans do, instead of 2 grams a day, 29 grams a day as of 2008 and rising, now what you do is you're filling up your fat cells and your inner mitochondrial membranes with these omega-6s, and guess what happens? We go back to oxidation. Now you start this lipid peroxidation cascade, because filling up your membranes is all these omega-6s where they shouldn't be. Now they're oxidizing one next to another. This happens, takes a millisecond. So in 1 second, in one cell, you'll oxidize 1,000 of these molecules in 1 second. This is why you don't want to be, and guess what gets oxidized? The linoleic acid in the cardiolipin, which causes a 3-dimensional conformational change, causes loss of function. This is back to where you get this mitochondrial dysfunction, right? So we got to have these, yeah. But it's just like everything else. It's like saying, you need water, but you don't need 8 gallons a day. Everything is toxic in the right dose. Everything. Yeah. Right? So there's a sweet spot for all of this. There's a sweet spot for omega-6 and omega-3 and for iron and for vitamin A and every last thing you want to look at. You need this. You don't need too much.
Well, very good.
I hope that helped.
Dr. Chris Knobbe, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I think our audience is going to learn a lot and has learned a lot in this. And I want people to check out your website to learn more about what you're doing at cureamd.org. That's cureamd.org. And what other projects should we know about that you have going on, or anything else you'd like to share?
Well, I'm, mostly a nerd researcher, and so I'm pretty boring. But I'm collaborating with a very, very, very well-known author in the natural health space. I'm not sure I'm able to say this yet, but we are hopefully going to have a new book coming out next summer. on this very topic. We're going to cover all this in great detail. And so I've got that, and we're working with a big group of ophthalmologists, retina specialists, and vision scientists, and we're working on another big paper, and hopefully we can do a lot of things to start changing the world, moving in this direction. So this is my life's work, is this right here.
You got to embrace that brand. You got to be telling people these are not the oils you are looking for. You know, do that to your audience. It'll help them. Like
Right.
Star Wars.
Right.
Well, very good. Thanks a lot for joining us. It's been fun.
Thank you, David. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much.